the cancer just did not stop, and it eventually got her. And at that point, all that sense of me being the, captain of the universe, like, made of iron, impervious and unable to feel pain, all of those kind of stereotypes that I'd embraced so willingly just flew out the window. And I was the weakest, most saddest, floppiest, most useless piece of human bag that you'd ever seen. I had no idea. With her, I'd lost who I was because we'd been together and grown up together. If you survive, because it's a bit touch and go when you don't know who you are. Did you know there's a whole place where people talk about emotions and they're kind of honest and real and authentic? I didn't know this existed, but it was happening in every coffee shop.
The conversation we had the other day about your story, very tough, very hard. Can you tell me a bit about that, please?
Hamish, thank you so much for having me on. I feel, quite, it's quite novel and special to reach out and to have a conversation, to find someone so like-minded, right? But at the other side of the world, it's kind of, it's reassuring, but also adventurous at the same time. So thanks, mate, for the opportunity. Yeah, my story, crikeys, there's always that hesitation. There's always that sense of, I'm giving of myself, and the first thing that pops into my head is, does anyone even want to hear my story? Right? That sort of universal feeling of imposter syndrome, right? So, but since you've asked,
The stage is yours. You for the next 90 minutes. Then I got to go somewhere else.
Fabulous. Yeah, mate. I guess there are, I like to think of, my life now in seasons, right? I started out as being, a product of, typical Australian sort of, lower to middle to lower class, high levels of dysfunction amongst, in terms of relationships. But we lived in a lucky country. So you could be miserable, poor, and still experience, life in a whole bunch of, bountiful ways. You getting outside, playing sport, swimming, adventuring. But to be honest, Australian men have not been traditionally good at being vulnerable, being nurturing, being, even spending time. That was not the thing. And often they were even at my parents' generation were often recovering from even worse parenting. It was the same in the UK, where a whole generation were suffering undiagnosed PTSD after 2 world wars and the depression and things like that. So their lives were difficult, and they were unresolved in many ways in their trauma. So, and of course, generations pass those through. They might not leave you much in the way of inheritance, but epigenetically, they often leave you quite a lot of sort of trauma, genetic trauma. So I felt that, but of course, you didn't recognize it. There wasn't anything you didn't look into a book, or there was no online, of course, to say, well, your teachers didn't go, wow, you're carrying lots of adverse childhood experiences, aren't you? Right? Very much it was, you're either a rat bag or a good kid. You're either sort of well off and fancy, or poor, and, you kind of, things were much more sort of categoried, and you stayed in. So that meant that by the time I was, sort of a teenager, I'd been locked into my dysfunction, if you will. Like I was never broken, but I wasn't operating exactly smoothly, right? Well and truly in need of a decent amount of sort of bolt tightening and greasing, right? And I sat in front of this delightful lass who was a member of the surf club, and I'd seen her, and I had a fascination for her. I sheepishly chatted away, and then we sort of, hooked up at a surf club dance one night, and that almost undid me, but I sort of came back and offered to be a bit more of a gentleman and take her out. And anyway, that we met at school at 16, and we ended up being together through school and then getting engaged and married early, and sort of taking on life, right? So I literally met my wife. She was the sort of second girl I'd ever gone out with, and I met her at school sitting behind me in class. And so, we got one of the interesting things about that was you didn't you didn't have much idea about being romantic, or, like we were 16-year-old Aussie kids, right? That romance involved, right, a straight bat and a couple of beers afterward. But we grew up together and solved problems together. So we just had this very practical relationship, but it was very nice. We were, at some part siblings, some part boyfriend, girlfriend. There was a naivety, and yet we were kind of dealing with problems of life as a team, right? So there was a good partnership. It just grew inevitable, and we solved problems. We eventually had kids. So we had 3 kids together. I ended up being in the corporate world the whole time. All all the rotten stuff that I had the propensity to do or be, she tempered that, right? She helped me find a different pathway. So I became productive and useful, and even kind of, influential at somewhat point. Now I took that, being a bloke, right? I thought that was all my work, right? Yeah. I thought I was amazing. So we kind of, our kids were sort of moving on. They were all at school. So our youngest was 5, and a sort of 9 and a 12-year-old. And she wasn't well. She hadn't been well for quite some time. And eventually that became a bit critical. So we moved. I took her to hospital, and there was admission and surgery. And then the words, surreal words, that were, well, actually, I'm afraid to say this is benign. This is malignant. You have a tumor in your bowel, and it's malignant. And that, just hearing that, I couldn't get my head around it at first, right? But anyway, that began this roller coaster of ignorance and learning, and in the learning, you learnt things you never want to hear, and then you were given tasks you never want to take on, and then the whole time you're kind of trying to be positive and hopeful and connected to the people who wanted to help you, but constantly being disappointed and pushed back and having to deal with the fear of this whole thing. So it was 12 months. She had bowel cancer. It was stage 4, and she was the most amazing, tough, strong, uh, determined lady I had ever met. And she was so courageous during all of that. But it was inexorable. The cancer just did not stop. And it eventually got her. And at that point, all that sense of me being the, captain of the universe, like, made of iron, impervious, and unable to feel pain, all of those kind of stereotypes that I'd embraced so willingly just flew out the window. And I was the weakest, most saddest, most, floppiest, most useless piece of human bag that you'd ever seen. I had no idea. I'd lost with her, I'd lost who I was because we'd been together and grown up together. I don't know. That sounds a bit dramatic. I hope I'm not freaking anyone out. But in that time, you know, if you survive, because it's a bit touch and go when you don't know who you are, you don't know how you're going to do this anymore. You have people still relying on you, people still having expectations of you, people still just assuming that you were coping. And, like so many of us, and particularly blokes, the mask I put on was the only one I had left, which was that stereotypical, look at me, I'm doing it. I'm tough, I'm strong, I'm resilient. But I was just water inside. And I had no one in my world who wanted to find out any kind of deeper truth. Everyone was so equally unable to address the real issue of loss and grief and pain that they would they would accept my masking. They would say, "Oh, how you going, mate? You must be feeling pretty bad." And I'd go, "Look, I'm not doing too bad. We're holding it together. The kids are good. We have our days, and it's a bit sad, but yeah, I'm doing all right." And they go, "Oh, that's good news. Let's go and have a beer one day, or you know, I'll get you around for a barbie or something." And what a hoax that all is. Hamish, that's got nothing to do with where we are at time. I was so without sort of wanting to sort of make this a pity party, I was, you know, uh, I was sitting there without any real belief that I would cope. And when you don't believe you cope, hope and people come and go and they don't sort of crack that veneer, your hope slowly goes, right? And when hope goes, that's the protective space where, things that anchor you to life, things, like belonging and relationship and stuff, they don't help you anymore, right? Because you can't get to them. You don't have the hope to grease the wheel, if you will. And you learn things about yourself that you don't that are really hard to focus. And I know you saw something, right? I thought, I had that thought about me being, a hero of the world and my, family and, captain of my universe. And what I did know, right, and I've said this before, that I discovered I'd been a self-indulgent wanker, that the person who had kept me together, who was absolutely my rock, was the person who was no longer around anymore. And that it wasn't me being a hero, it was me being very much a part of, all of the things she created, part of her reality. And I was the kind of front man for an organization that she was the engine room of. It was pretty tough to be in that situation. And you find out that the world doesn't have a lot of resource available for men who are kind of left on their own and need help, because no blokes usually ask for it. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, falling through that gap, yes, I'm okay, that mask. I haven't been through that. I don't have that experience, but I've done the yes, I'm okay when I'm dying inside, so I can feel that. And and I've been on the other side. I've been, how you doing, John? Yeah, I'm fine. Good. Let's go and have a beer. I've done that as well because I don't know how to carry your grief. I don't know how to do that. That language wasn't anything I knew. I didn't know how to be that support, and oftentimes I still don't.
Yeah, we're not. There's no training academy that every bloke has to go through and qualify from. There's no boot camp that you can't enter your 20s until you pass. Your introduction to empathy and introduction to connection courses, right? So a lot of blokes, given that you model what you see, and our fathers, have, not been a great model in most cases, right? So, and of course, there are, blokes who understand, who get this unlocked. And it's one of those interesting things, right? Because like, as I navigated the things that were potentially very, very sort of dangerous for me, as I dealt with my suicidal ideation, as I sat there on long nights, right, unable to sleep, deciding whether tomorrow would happen or not. And as I got you know, I stumbled into things that helped. So I discovered that there's a did you like, I know this, for me at the time, this was revelatory, but did you know there's a whole range of, there's a whole place where people talk about emotions and they're kind of honest and real and authentic. I didn't know this existed, but it was happening in every coffee shop, right? While blokes went to work, right? Women and were getting together and sharing these these conversations that I were kind of extraordinary conversations. People would ask you how you felt, and then they would expect you to answer, not say fine and move on, right? Um, so because I had a young daughter, she was 5, and so her friends' mothers were helping me sort of navigate a complete area of incompetence, which was, young looking after young children. I'd been in the corporate world. This was an area I had no idea, and they kind of helped. And so you would sit down and have a coffee, and these conversations were new and kind of dazzling, right? How are you feeling? No, no, I mean, how are you feeling? Not like, I'm not interested in the bullshit.
Mm.
Um, and so, and then so I learnt there, and I realized if I was going to survive, I had to find a different way of doing things. So I went seeking answers, and it's like I tried a well trodden path, reading Eckhart Tolle and Marianne Williamson, and you know, you know, the books of shelf development, right? So, um, and then, I was in the corporate world, and I realized that I had a soul, and that soul was worth saving, and that I had to leave corporate world to save what was left of it. So, in many ways, the thing that was the most intolerable experience of my life began the most important and positive sort of journey of my life, which was to become someone better, become a better bloke. Um, and I needed to. I needed to for me. I needed to for my kids, and I suddenly realised that I could, as I learnt how to be a better bloke, I could also contribute more to the world, and that became my purpose. So it's very exciting to get up every day and not have to ask yourself, why are you there? You know, I don't have an existential crisis before I have Weet-Bix, like I d yeah, I coffee, toast, and then I just wonder who's gonna bump into me today that I'm available for to help or serve. And that is very freeing. Yeah. And, um and it's also been really helpful, right? Because a part of that journey was allowing me, because the universe decided that, that experience, 19 years ago was only the beginning of a whole range of tough days for John to go through. So I ended up finding, apparently, blokes like myself and maybe you, Hamish, apparently we don't learn anything unless we're being kicked while lying in the ground, in a fetal position, by being stomped on by the universe. Apparently, that's the best way we learn. So, I have had a few of those experiences, almost becoming grateful for them, and in the end, that might be a bit controversial, but
You have nailed so many things there, which are amazing things to talk about. I mean, where do we start? Um, where do we start? I mean, I've written down the ungrateful wanker, being kicked down by the universe. I mean, that's the universe, that whole thing. I'm really aware that it seems to be the current thing seems to be people only learn at the moment by stuff that happens to them. We don't have elders to advise. Certainly in the West, there's not that. Um, So the only way you do it is when the shit hits the fan, when you are on your knees crying, when everything has gone wrong. It's just like, well, I've got two choices. As you said, is today going to be my last day? That is a choice. Um, Fortunately, you chose that's not.
I did. And men choose to ignore it, right? Like one of the great survival strategies of men, right? And I say men not because I don't include women. It's just that I don't have a reference point for women. I'm by far, not an expert in women, right? But they choose to ignore, even the need to make these choices, right? So we get into
Mm.
these behaviors that are that are totally avoidant. And what's interesting is the coalition of men through the masculine culture to promote that kind of avoidance. So you end up being pushed by masculine culture, by other men, when you are not conforming, because you're actually, by your actions, you're throwing some light on their choices and saying, you know, are you really making a decent choice? Is this the best way for a man to serve himself, his loved ones, and the world? Right, and often it's not. Right, we can hide in the structures of the world. We can hide in a corporate structure. So our values, we throw our values into the cupboard, the coat rack, when we walk in, and we pick up the values of a corporation, right, or a group, or or a organization that we associate ourselves with, and those values are not human, because a company has no soul, a corporation has no humanity, right? And that is a tool for oppressing people's humanity, because that gets in the way of production or profit, right? So if you want to be a human, and believe me, it's a good thing to be, from my experience and from the experience of watching other people do it, right? To me, the best kind of experience in life is a human one, right? And a caring one, and a one that focuses on love and kindness and other virtues, right? Like compassion, right, and service, right? So when you focus on them, the rewards are amazing, and I think, but they're scary rewards. They're like, that's hard work to reveal yourself. It's hard when you are conditioned from an early age, and in fact, conditioned from previous generations to not do it, right? The people we love and admire and look up to, they didn't do it. Our fathers didn't do it. Our grandfathers didn't do it. The good men in the community didn't do it. The men we see and admired in the greater society often don't do it. So we're sitting there, being taught or conditioned to see certain behaviors like, resistance, the desire to own or acquire things, the desire to stand our ground regardless of the validity of the cause, the idea of revenge, right? What is that? That's toxic to a person's love, right? That's not a love choice, right? The idea of being in charge of people, right, and stopping them from making choices or having the right to do things. Those kind of things are really, really not great choices for a man. But
Mm.
we go into this environment where we put our values down, we pick up those values, and then we execute them with no accountability. And I think, that's inevitably going to cause a problem in you. So I see men being sick or stressed, or relationships break down, or, perish the thought that we lose a man every minute in the Western world to suicide. Um, you know, it's like, it's outrageous that this causes so much damage, and yet there's zero, like, people are talking about it, but we're not taking action in a communal action to change it. And for me, I'm just grateful that the universe kicked the crap out of me. So I had to face some of these choices, and I got to make them. Not because that turned me into a more important or a higher person. What it did was it connected me to the need and the joy in serving. That sounds a little like maybe I haven't given up that old sort of, indulgent wanking bit, right? But there's a real ROI in that. Hey, you're called. You have a purpose, right? And we are called. When you touch it, you want more of it. It's a good place to spend your energy, to love, to care, and connect. And it's not because we're seeking perfection like that. That's complete delusion if you think perfection is available to you as a bloke. But because it's the right challenge for us. Let's take on a challenge to grow every day better, to every day be more connected, to every day be more caring, to be more compassionate. Can we let go? Like the Dalai Lama, I'm always so impressed. And I often remind myself, John, you're not the Dalai Lama, but but maybe one day you can sort of, forgive enough people that you start to at least sort of, remind people of him, right? Because it's that whole, I used to look at blokes for no good reason and suddenly have this urge to sort of get into a scrap with them, or, I just didn't like, you didn't like someone just looking at them. And now I spend an awful lot of energy trying to overcome that conditioning, right? So, and I look at a bloke and I think, whoa, John, you know, hold, you know, hold your saddle here, right? Let's take a step back and let's really be curious about this person and to see what qualities, what beauty they possess. And that's, yeah. And, I'm not, I'm a tyro. I'm a work in progress in that space. But my goodness, it feels good when you connect with people through curiosity and generosity. And, how many people, are we seeing unable to connect to that, and all of the pain that they scream out on the street at others, the vitriol, the trolling, it's all pain from them, and they're trying to get it out. But but screaming it out as abuse is the worst way to get it out. That's what I reckon.
I ask you a question, you give me 6 more questions to ask. I mean, we'll be here forever, I think. This is like, off we go. I love it.
I'll speak in points, mate. Just ask away,
Oh, God,
right?
no.
I'm
This
very
is not a
excited
PowerPoint
to
presentation.
answer. I'm loving your questions. So, yeah, more of them.
Yeah, no, this is definitely not a PowerPoint presentation. No, God forbid. No, like you, I didn't do corporate, not for long anyway. I guess that's a place to start. I mean, why did you leave the corporate?
When the stone of loss and grief hit that pond, right, it was a huge splash. Totally disrupted my serenity, my capability. Everything that I wanted calm in the world was disrupted. But as the ripples spread out, the ripples went out in an unbiased kind of circle, right? They would go to all places. So some of the ripples were really hard for me to deal with. I had to navigate really sad kids, and I had so much anger, right? And I had so much shame around that whole death, right? Like he just as an example, you're a bloke. I've been with my wife for 27 years. We were still young, but it had been a long time. And at that point, right, when she's gone, you're sitting there and your mind's useless, right? You're a robot. And then a thought comes up and going, oh, maybe I can sort of travel now, or maybe I'll have a new relationship, or maybe I can do something exciting. And you suddenly realize that, that was kind of an exciting opportunity, and the shame about feeling that way, right? Just even if it's a passing thought, right? Because, I was committed to my, to my soulmate. I And it's so bizarre, right? The pain towards the end of her, illness when it was a beautiful summer Australian spring day. Actually, it was autumn, right? And, the weather was perfect. It wasn't too hot. It was warm, but not hot. There was a beautiful sea breeze. We lived on the beaches, um, and we were visiting a doctor, and we were walking back in the sun, and I was holding her up because she was so frail. And the dichotomy of that moment, right, which it was just this the place we live is beautiful, and it was just this beautiful sunny Aussie day. And she was so frail, she could barely walk. And she looked up at me and she thanked me. And like, I was overwhelmed. And at that moment, like, how could she thank me you know, for just, for holding up someone who had devotedly looked after me, without quietly and, without fuss and demand, just for me doing something that was easy, physically supporting her. And at that moment, I remember thinking, I don't, suddenly just blown over by the overwhelming feeling that I have never loved anything more than my wife at that moment. That there wasn't a single, even Tim Tams I hadn't, like there was nothing in my life I'd experienced that was more that moment of more unconditional love. And then, of course, you go, oh shit, she's not going to be around, right? It's almost like the pinnacle of that journey of love. And I didn't think about it until later, right? This idea, because at the time it was just too painful to think on. But later on, I was so grateful for having that moment, right? The education of my heart, the softening, right? That, all of that conditioning to make me a hard person. It was like applying, a salve to the scar tissue to free and soften it up. And that moment, right? So even at her end, she was transformational for me as a person, right? So then, you know, so as I went back to work and I'm trying to sit there in the corporate world and they're giving me tasks that were terrible tasks. I was outsourcing work or I was trying to, you know, I was, I was retrenching people or cutting contracts or, and I just went, oh, this is not in honor of that moment. This is not the best use of my head and my heart in service to her memory, to what she'd taught me. So I just realized if I stayed in the corporate world, that increasing dissonance would kill me. So I had to get out, right? And so you leave, right? So the ripples of that crash in the pond of my life, not every ripple caused suffering. Some of them saved me, and I left corporate world to become a better person because there was no soul in the corporate. And I worked for the biggest IT company in the world at the time, and I had 300 people reporting to me, and I traveled the world, and I had to go. I had to let all of that go to become a person that I would like to be. Um, and I was also, to be fair, um, although you don't reach out for help, so that was probably sort of 18 months after she'd passed away. Everything takes a long time when you're sort of locked in grief. But I was also mad as a cut snake. right? So because anger, grief, you're not cognitively capable, right? So half the time you would sit. Some days I would sit there, and I've got like some strategic planning in my, and I couldn't even understand it, right? You are messed up. And yeah, and the world doesn't deal with messed up men very well, right? So, you know, you know, so I was, you go from top talent team to being the subject of quiet coffee nook conversations, right? Why? At one stage, some members of my team called me Mr. Titanium. I think Avatar had just come out. So, because you're just not there. You're just going through, and yeah, and I eventually somebody told me, uh, someone convinced me. It was a bloke who I admired, and he just said, "You've got to talk to someone." I didn't know how to do that. There was no explanation. No one. Didn't know anyone who'd gone through that process at the time, or at least they hadn't shared that. Anyway, I reached out and I found someone. The doctor diagnosed me with complicated grief.
What is complicated grief?
Apparently, according to the DSM-5, it's grief that impacts you too greatly for too long.
Okay.
So you're meant to be, you know, you you're meant to spend 27 years as a symbiotic creature with someone, and then when a dramatic separation occurs due to cancer, you get 6 months, and then you need to be over it. Otherwise, some bloke in a white coat is going to give you a diagnosis. So, and I got a few. I had general anxiety disorder, and adjustment syndrome. So, and that none of those things or none of the intervention, like it's part of the landscape of change, but it's not particularly useful. All of the useful change came from talking to people with lived experience.
Yeah. That's what it comes down to, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mm.
But it takes a while to find them.
Yeah. And to be able to talk and to be able to open up and to be able to clean your teeth one morning and get out of bed another morning and stuff like that. Yeah.
And of course, my kids, the poor buggers, they'd suffered through that. As an angry man, that's not a great place when they don't have anyone else to rely on. And of course, there's the complication of me being terribly concerned in how to help them and being completely clueless about how to raise kids on my own. And the single most obnoxious statements ever made to people, male or female, I imagine, in that situation where they've lost their partner, is, "Oh, well, now you'll have to be the mother or the father," right? How can you what? Just think about that. First of all, let's dismiss the person you've lost as oh, you can just fill the gaps, right? And then you can be someone you're completely not, right? And then you're going to have to pretend. So you present a kind of fill in, a minimization of the role of your partner to your children. It just seems a very strange thing. So yeah, but anyway, you find out how to do your best, and of course, doing your best it's like the 80-20 rule. It's probably enough, because people are incredibly resilient. They're like a really robust indoor plant. You know how you can go away on holidays, come back, and it looks like it's miserable, about to fall off the twig, and you give it a bit of a drink and maybe a sprinkling of plant food or something, and then come back in a couple of days and the thing's bright green and reaching for the sun again. And I think people are a lot like that, in that they have the inbuilt resilience, the inbuilt strength, and it's like it's inside, but part of the secret of turning it on, of unlocking it, involves connecting with someone else. So, everyone possesses the things they need to have to thrive. Sometimes it's more difficult to get to because there's more scar or more noise or more garbage placed on their shoulders, right? Due to the world not treating them appropriately. But everyone possesses those powers. What they do need, though, is someone to come in and help them, recharge, clear the area, help them pull themselves up, help walk next to them, whatever all those sort of fancy metaphors about, being helpful.
I think you've nailed something that you've actually validated a conversation I've had numerous times with some friends. I think to thrive, you need people, not that unhealthy need, but that healthy, all of that. I need your love, your patience, your calm to help flick a switch so I can become that next iteration of me. And I think you've nailed it really beautifully there because it's hard to connect, especially as a man. And as I said, I don't have your experience, and I'm laughing. I'm laughing at your kids coming in at 6 in the morning about something, and you have no idea what to do with it. And I can't be the mum because I'm not a mum, and all these kind of things. And I would probably have lined up a whole row of expletives before the poor child went out of the bedroom, and things like that. So I don't know how you got through that.
I used to get up, right? I'd go to bed at 3 and get up at 5 to make, just so that I could make them breakfast and put together a lunchbox, right? Because it was not my strong suit, right? It wasn't like grab, bang, bang, bang in there, take off, right? It would take me hours to sort of, and they struggled through the most diabolical food offerings that I put in front of them, and they were really they were really nice about it. They would go like, "Oh, Dad, yeah, yeah, no, this is the best you've done so far," right? And then I could detect eventually after a certain passage of time, I detected a change in their voice. So when they said, "Dad, this is the best you've given us," right? It was actually a positive, right? I realized at some point I'd turned a corner from inedible to edible, right? So, and then eventually I turned it into something desirable, right? So, but that, they were so nice about that journey. And here's the thing about that whole process. We, we have to find the resources in ourselves to make transformation. Healing and transformation is something we do from the inside out. But we are conditioned to rely, we're told you are not enough. Stay in your role, stay in your lane, stay in your place, dream but don't expect. Right? You need to do the hard work just to get, a subsistence amount of care and life, right? But so we're conditioned to have people allow us to live. So we want them to solve things. It's the matrix, green or blue or red pill, right? Give me what I need. And if you're suffering, if you're in the wrong place, if you're just unlucky and happen to be at the point of a tough moment, you look for an answer. Why is this happening to me? Why is no one reaching out? Why is no one helping me? Why is no one, given me this or made me do this or learn this or whatever? And the answer is because it has to be you. There is no answer. So when I would sit on the bed or I would look over, I had I had a beautiful view out to a bay, and I would stand there at 2 in the morning and just make those decisions to keep going. When I would look out and I would blame, I would yell at the universe, I would shake my fist at God, I would think of my friends who were still married and still had intimate partners and still had joy and ease in their life, and I would just blame them for not doing enough to help me. And it was only until I slowly realized that the only one who could heal was me. And then I suddenly, when you change from reaching out, looking for people to give you an answer, to reaching out and looking for people to share their wisdom, right? And to just connect where no words need to be exchanged, right? Um, that's when I began to take ownership of my own healing journey. And I remember thinking something. You have all these friends who gather around you at a crisis, and there are people you expect a lot from, and they really struggle to deliver anything. And then there are these beautiful, unexpected pearls in this whole, you know, experience that just you walk in and they are glowing, inwardly glowing, and just their very care and presence. They don't do anything different in many cases, but they are with you, and they're with you at an energetic, at that like heart level. And it's their strength and their care that transforms your experience, right? Because with everyone else, they come in, often they're just as damaged about your loss as you are. So, so often you find you're actually helping them cope with your loss, right? So many people are a drain on a person going through grief. And these beautiful souls, right, believe that those people are the answer to our mental health challenges in the community, because the system continually pathologizes people, and the system says, no, you've got to follow the rules, or because it's too risky to do anything else. But in the community, that's where we will do 80% of that support. So the system can deal with complex issues, or, sticking bits back together and gluing them back on. But it's going to be those glowing members of our own community that don't even recognize their power, that we need to promote, because they're going to offer us the way that in the next decade, no system will have the resources to solve everybody's mental health challenges. No system will be able to deal with the mental distress of modern life. AI. Just think about the PTSD requirements of an entire country like Ukraine, or similar, right? We're going to have to find ways for the community to care for each other, and I think that I've seen that through my own experience, through what I would say to anyone is something I would change if in a nanosecond if I had the chance. And yet I would not change the learning, the connection, the purpose, the understanding and the care that I've gained out of that experience. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. The fact that you were able to lose your soulmate, your childhood sweetheart, and realize that it happened, shit happens. It's not your responsibility for what happens around you, but it's your responsibility to make sense of it. And you've done that. You have been able to say, okay, shit happens. I'm not going to sink. And that makes you remarkable. That makes you so remarkable. I'm not blowing smoke. I'm not blowing smoke. So
I feel it's
remarkable.
a little smoky.
It's getting thick, isn't it? Going through. But seriously, you made such a choice there, and I know a bit more of your backstory and what you do. You are one of those shining people. But John, I mean, I think this, just take my hat off to you. It's those choices change everything. You've changed your kids' lives. You help them.
It works reciprocally, and humans are beautifully designed for that, Hamish, right? That's how any greatness is achieved. Um, you know, Great men will tell you how powerfully they strode the world alone like a colossus, and then you just look at the people who are holding them up as they walk, right? We're designed to operate that way. And we've got this kind of, we put barriers in the way of our connection. I would love for us to believe the highest calling is not as a CEO, but as a CCC, a communication and connection, commander, right? Like, imagine going around and having, like, the unit of humanity, the single basic, sort of currency of humanity is conversation. So imagine if we had people whose jobs, who had that talent to connect, who had that desire to be curious, had the bravery to be available and to be authentic. And then all their job was just to go and talk to people who needed a good, caring conversation at the time. We wouldn't need giant hospitals half the time. I think medicine is extraordinary. The knowledge is there, but no one invented the knowledge. The knowledge is always there. It just flows through. That, incredible, great men tapped into the knowledge in the ancient days. I'm a bit of a Stoic, so I read the Stoics, and I just go, man, how clever were these Greeks and Romans, right? Um, what gives me the right to believe I'm cleverer simply because I can press the keys on a computer, right? These, like, I love that whole idea that human capacity at that kind of reality level, consciousness level, is unchanged, right? The fact that we have different tools and so on is a credit to the time, the power of our inventiveness and creativity, and resilience, because, you know, life is not easy. And I'm often touched just by, when I think about, read stories of, like, of past battles or challenges or calamities. And you think, for every son, every corpse on a long lost historical battlefield, there was a mother who is absolutely gutted. We have failed to record that side of history, the humanness of all of this, right? And as a consequence, sometimes we end up with dickheads like the American, cabinet at the moment, but because they've lost their humanness, right? But if we champion that, if every bloke who doesn't know how he's going to get through, who his relationship and he has broken down to the point where he's struggling to get access to his kids, every bloke who's over 50 and has a young MBA graduate walk in and say you're no longer needed, all those years of experience, it can be expressed in 2 week severance, right? If all of those blokes find that as a call to action to be a more heart-based, more kind and compassionate leader, will change all of, the leadership will slowly shift, because they are powerful men and they have that power of experience and that power of, the light will turn on if they choose that path, I reckon.
There's your elders. There's the next generation of elders, isn't it? The men and the women, the crones, the women displaced the same kind of way. Well, that's not just a displaced. Well, it is just like you're no longer needed. Go and be the wise woman. Go and be the wise man, because
The
we don't
leadership of the
have that.
village, yeah, the
Mm,
leadership of the village wasn't gendered. It was power based, right? Like,
yeah.
in the days, and we've learned a lot. We don't need to go back to live in mud and herd cows, right?
Mm.
But that whole concept, right? The community and humanness of that concept, we've thrown that out, because we believe they were, they weren't sophisticated. But you lose the knowledge in, the innate knowledge when you do that, right? Why did our dads didn't have this woke dialogue? How did they survive? Well, they did it tough, but they did it because they had, institutions that were face to face care. They were places where men could get together. The community center, the veterans organizations, the old bastards, the the Rotary. clubs, they were, and we've kind of lost them as well, right? So we haven't replaced that human. We've thrown out the best along with the old, right, or the worst. And I love that sense of, you know, you know, the power of women and the power of men, the fire and the red tent, right? Passing on, elders had entente. They knew their role, right? And it was specific. We could train the hunters and we could train young men to be respectful of the world, the environment, the connection, and of course, women's business. In Australia, we have the wisdom of Indigenous peoples, right? The Australians, the First Nations people. They have secret men's and secret women's business, right? In many ways, the matriarch is the most important person in some of the mob's business, right? Because they're in charge of the family, they're in charge of the heart, they're in charge of the legacy, So I think there's lots to learn, even in the history we've discarded as not being modern, right? And when you sit and talk to people who have another way of thinking, we grow, we can acquire that, right? And what we do instead, because somebody tells us to hate, is we condemn and troll people who are different, instead of what we should be doing is inviting them and growing from their contribution. That's a little high level, but uh, I believe that that's part of of who I am, who I've become, right? And Abraham Maslow's pyramid, right, where we had the fundamental building blocks of life, food, shelter, um, safety, and then you climb the pyramid to get to self-actualization. Well, he was even more impressed with his second pyramid, which was an inverted one, and he called it the being pyramid. So when you are self-actualized, you're able to step into being more. You become a part of the community, a part of the human race, a part of the universe, right? So you would cease to become actualized and you would start to become completely connected. So that's one that they don't share too often, but that was Maslow's last work. And that's where I think I've been climbing that pyramid, and now I'm looking at the pyramid beyond and saying, how can I be more? How can I be less but more? How can I? And technology can be so enabling for that, because we're here, we're talking, and we're feeding off each other. We're able to connect energetically, consciously. We're able to inspire each other. You've inspired me to think and to expand my view, and hopefully I can do something similar. And you're on the other side of the world, right? So yeah, it's possible.
And I've met Maslow's other triangle, but not as much detail. And I'm going to take that for a walk this afternoon, find a podcast and listen to that, because there's magic there, isn't it? It's yeah. I was going to say you've individuate, you've managed to get out of that complete survival, starting to thrive, become somebody, and then like I can give back. I can be more than just take. I can start to share, empower other people. Everything that we've been talking about.
It's so hard, right? Because sitting here and letting go of things you've believed. Because belief is what we know to be true. Values are what we know are important, right? Just, to, quickly sort of throw a very quick definition. We believe that money is important to us, that material things represent validation. We believe that you need to give to get, right? We believe that we are individual, separated, that we need to defend ourselves from the world, right, before we let anyone in, so that we treat boundaries as walls, not gates, right? All of those beliefs need to be changed, and one of to allow more expansion of your life. you're not changing them because you're an angel, right? You're changing them because you get more out of life when you experience more, when you bring in more things, when you allow them to flow in and out according to their own ebb, right? When you go with the tides of life, and because you're being one of the members of that tide, right? You're flowing with it. There's no force, there's no conflict, there's no barrier, right? All you have to do is to float and enjoy it, right? So what I love is this idea that there's even a scientific name. There's a name for the study of being. It's called ontology, right? And it's just, I used to say something and not believe what I was saying. And I saw Amy Cuddy's TED talk one time where she says, "Say it till you become it." Right. And so I sort of embraced that. I just went, it wasn't like I wasn't trying to, I recognized that I hadn't got to that level of openness yet. So when I would say to somebody, oh, I need like kids, I love you, not your behavior. That was always a, sort of conscious competence. I knew I should say that, but I just wanted to, smack him across the ear hole, right? Yeah, right. I had not caught up and at a heart level with that concept. How do you let go of the need, when you've had injustice done to you, right? How do you let go? How do you let go of the belief that they've violated you because they've taken something physical from you or they've invaded your space, right? How do you let that go? How do you meaningfully change your attitude, your belief about that? It's not easy. You're sitting there and it's all right. Me and you chatting on a podcast, I can tell you I've done that or, till the cows come home. But, when push comes to shove, and I have literally been in the firing line when I feel that violation as a real event occurring to me, I go back to what's conditioned and I hate, or I want revenge, or I want justification, or, I want to see them suffer like I feel like I have. Gosh, my goodness, when you can work on that, that's when you start to unravel some really deep stuff. And I started, believe it or not, this journey of trying to unravel my aggression and my anger and my condemnation. I started on road rage. Hamish, you wouldn't know what that is, right? But I'm sure you've
Oh,
seen a
no.
YouTube.
Never heard of road rage. No, never sworn at some fucking dickhead driver swerving in front of me in my life. Never hit the horn and done this to him. Never.
Where'd he get his license, mate? Right? From some friggin' cereal packet, right? What? Go, hand your grandmother's license back to her, you goose, right? Because like you can't drive. Yeah, no, absolutely. And it was that senselessness of it. Like we are angry because we're afraid, and that fear. That's the men. That goes to the point of shame. Why are men shaming themselves and others? Because they cannot deal with being afraid. And that goes right back to even the fear of death. So a few years ago, I got really sick. I had sepsis. And at one point I was lying down. I was in a pretty bad way and I had a lot going on. I had, wounds and, and I felt like I was wearing a bodysuit of lava, right? You're in such pain. And I remember being so tired because I couldn't sleep and I couldn't think in this fog of pain. Had no drugs weren't working. I had no idea how to deal with it. And the world, I'd kind of created a bubble, from the sort of resilience and try, while I was trying to journey through grief and, so I didn't have a lot of close people who, would, you know, feed you chicken soup. Um, So I'm sitting there just dealing with this, and I felt this, pain in my left side, right, and down my arm, and I thought, I'm having a heart attack as on top of everything, because sepsis sort of breaks down all your systems, right? So, and I just said I really should get to the hospital. But it was during COVID, and the hospital was a disaster, and I couldn't raise a trot. So I just said, "Oh, well," and I thought I contemplated the idea of the consequence of the action I was about to take, which was gonna roll over and try and take another couple of, pills and see if I could sleep. And if I was having a heart attack, that might be the end of me, right? And at that point, I just said, "Look, I'm okay with that," right? I realize that I'm gonna make a choice, and it's about my, dignity. I'm not afraid of the consequences, because I'd been through this whole process of being ill and of struggling and of contemplating my own existence, whether I choose it or not. And I realized that if I chose to roll over and sleep, that was probably more of a life choice than going to the hospital. And so I did. And I woke up, thought about, woke up, thankfully. And the next day I thought about that, and I recalled the concept of memento mori from the reading the Stoics, right? The sense of that's my moment of life. And in that acceptance that I was, that I live right up until I don't, in that moment, right, I realized that I had changed. I had accepted the fact that I was going to die, and I wasn't afraid of that. I didn't like the idea, but I was terrified, or I wasn't turning away from it out of fear. And there was such freedom in that. And that was the beginning of me accepting, strangely, that I could do more in the world, right? Because, the consequence of not doing it was death, and that was okay. Let me push right up until that barrier, right? And if it came tomorrow or next week or in 10 years, so be it, right? And I think that's an important journey for men to have, because we hang on to stuff so vigorously. So, in relationships, men don't commit, and then they jump in. So they are devastated when relationships break off, right? They don't have a plan B, right? And what are men? Why do men cheat, right? Why do they sabotage? Why do they, work? They love their family, and they rationalize providing for them by not being with them, right? You know, all of these challenges are about, the misunderstanding we have about who we are and how safe we are. That's where I've got to. Gosh, it sounds like I've done something clever, but I doubt that. Um, but I love hearing the sound of my own voice. So sorry I've inflicted.
I could listen for a lot longer. We've got an awful lot of fantastic content, a fabulous conversation. It's been super. We will have to do this again. There is no doubt about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Been so joyful to chat with you, and I do podcasts for Kintsugi Heroes, which is just about. It's not about me. I'm not It's about offering a platform for people to share a story, because so many humans need to hear stories. Right, and they need to hear everyday stories. They don't need, like sometimes, celebrity people have, good stories to share, or, but we also need to hear the story of Bert, who raised 14 kids and loved to fish on Sundays, because he found the secret to make life, joyful, right? And often, the people we look to, they haven't got that secret. They're no better adverse. And what I think of my Kintsugi Heroes, which is the Japanese art of putting crockery together with gold mortar, right? So Kintsugi means that that pot is more beautiful, more valuable than when it was whole, right? The fact that our scars give us that value, right? I think that's the stories that you're helping bring to the world, right? And hopefully I can too. And I like to support men. The greatest thing in my life now is my kids are doing well. They're all, I've got a granddaughter who is just delightful if I ever get to see her, because now, you know, now young parents these days require an awful lot of checks before you got to get vaccinated and all that stuff before you can check in with your grandkids these days. But what I love about my life has conspired to put me into a place where I don't need much at all, right? All of that, six figure salaries and investments, and I lost my home when I was mad, and I'm pleased now that that happened because it's freed me up to just to have a conversation. No need for anyone to thank me, no need for anyone to pay me, no need for anyone to have any obligation at all, except for them to go on and maybe they maybe they heard something that will help them resource the next tough moment.
I think life is that simple, isn't it? At the end of the day, it's a little bit of love, a little bit of fun, a little bit of connection, a little bit of safety, and stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Could not agree more, my friend.
Well, John, this has been a fabulous conversation. Thank you ever so much. We'll definitely get you back on in weeks to come because I suspect you've got more things to say somehow, possibly.
Just warming up. No, mate, I appreciate it. It's been wonderful. Thank you for being so generous in your time and your affirmation. I really appreciate it, mate.
Good stuff. Thank you. Yeah. Well, everybody, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. That was John, quite a remarkable human being. Definitely coming back. You'll definitely hear more from him. So if you like the show, if you like what you heard, please listen again. Please subscribe. Please share it, because the intention of this podcast is to reach people, to share stories so people can look and listen, say, I like that. I've been going through that. I've got some ideas how I can make sense of life. So that's what it's all about.